and catalytic conversation around our topic, which is unlocking climate finance in the African continent. I don't know that any of you think of yourselves as locksmiths, but we assure you that today what we're trying to do is unpack the puzzle of the tension between what is an obvious and acknowledged need, an urgent imperative, and the reality of a seemingly very slow-moving course of action. So we're trying to figure out the paradox between a clear imperative, a definite course of action, and the fact that everything seems to be moving slower than it should. A few housekeeping matters as we begin. First of all, I'm sure you'll see a QR code up there. I'm sure you all have your phones, and some of you have resisted looking at them. Others of you have accepted that it is necessary for you to be looking at your phone in order to feel connected to the world. We invite you to connect even further by lifting up your phones, scanning that QR code, and responding to the questions that are raised in that QR code. There's a form that requires your attention and assistance. So I think the QR code is going to be up there for a few minutes. Please do scan it. Please do fill the form so that the team that organized this incredible conversation for us can have some insight into what remains to be done. So a brief outline of the roadmap of where we're going to be going this morning in terms of our conversation. We will shortly begin with a 2-minute statement by Mr. Claudio Barbaro, who is the Undersecretary of State for Environment and Energy Security for the Republic of Italy. We are honored to have him set the scene for us. And we're then going to transition into some conversation and sort of anchoring points for discussion on the question of climate finance from Professor Carlo Carraro. Professor Carraro is the Vice Chair of the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and also a Professor of Environmental Economics. So again, we start with a political point of view, we shift into a technical and scientific point of view, and then we get into a conversation on trade, because trade is what is going to unlock a lot of the future survivability of the African continent in the context of a global environment that's changing significantly on matters trade, geopolitics, and defense. So we have our Secretary General for the AFCFTA, Mr. Wamkele Mene, joining us from Accra. After that, we'll have a 15-minute break and be joined by the Cabinet Secretary for National Treasury and Planning, the Honorable Mbadi Ngongo, who will give us a keynote address. And then, last but not least, these chairs shall be occupied by a couple of insightful and provocative conversationalists and experts on things climate, sustainability, and finance. Professor Richard Calland and Mr. Ewan Lowe, who I'll introduce a little bit later in the program. So in short, we have what I hope is going to be a highly rewarding experience planned for you, and I look forward to your engagement and your interaction. And with that, I'll invite Mr. Barbaro to give us his remarks via video link. Thank you.
È per me un grande onore rivolgermi a voi in questo evento che rappresenta un'importante occasione di confronto su una delle sfide più urgenti del nostro tempo, il cambiamento climatico. L'Africa è al centro di questa sfida, ma è anche una terra di straordinarie opportunità. Il Kenya, con la leadership del Presidente Ruto, che ho avuto l'onore di incontrare nel 2023 all'Africa Climate Summit, sta dimostrando come lo sviluppo sostenibile e la tutela dell'ambiente possano andare di pari passo con la crescita economica e sociale. L'Italia è da sempre in prima linea nella lotta contro il cambiamento climatico e nella promozione di un modello di cooperazione energetica equo e sostenibile. Il nostro impegno nel continente africano si rafforza giorno dopo giorno e il Kenya ha un ruolo molto importante per l'Italia, come testimoniato dalla sua inclusione tra i paesi prioritari per la cooperazione italiana nel triennio 2024-2026 e tra i paesi pilota del piano Mattei per l'Africa. Ritengo fondamentale che governi, imprese e società civile uniscano le forze per affrontare questa sfida con determinazione. Sono certo che il vostro lavoro contribuirà a definire strategie efficaci per un'Africa più resiliente e sostenibile. Grazie e buon lavoro.
Thank you so much. We're now going to have Professor Carlo Carraro join us, again via video, with a brief presentation, just setting some framing thoughts and questions around climate finance and in particular adaptation finance. Professor Carraro, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this invitation. It is a nice opportunity. I'm really sorry not to be there with you today. Hope next year to be able to come and join the conversation with all of you. This session is on unlocking finance, and the focus this year, the focus I chose is on adaptation, because we really miss resources in adaptation, and financial resource adaptation are crucial for African development, not just for climate change, for African economic development. So let me start with a short, with a brief synthesis of what's the situation. I identified 5 shortfalls of climate adaptation finance in Africa, common to other kind of climate finance, including mitigation, but they're specifically important for adaptation. First of all, it's much lower than necessary. We all know this, and I'll show some number about it. It doesn't go where it's needed most, and it doesn't go where it is to the initiative where it's needed, because there are some very important initiatives where finance is still lacking, and we need more resources. Adaptation finance is committed but not necessarily spent. This is another important shortfalls. And finally, loan versus grants are debatable in excess of grants versus loans. So the question is, how can we address these shortfalls? Well, let me start by summarizing the situation. Climate finance is not enough, and we know it's not enough, it's not sufficient in Africa. Only 10% of global resources devoted to climate finance go to adaptation. So adaptations in particular missing resources. And here we have 2 sources of information. One is CPI, the other one is UNEP, and both conclude that finance for adaptation is about 20–25% of the future estimated needs. Future means 2030, 2035. So short-term estimated needs. And therefore, we should find ways to increase climate finance in the coming years. It doesn't go where it needs most. These diagrams show how the more vulnerable countries, the more vulnerable African countries get less funding, less finance than the richest one, the less vulnerable one. So there is another important contradiction, another uneven distribution of finance. It doesn't go where it's needed most, and it doesn't go to the innovative solution for adaptation. It focuses a lot on water, on agriculture. These 2 sectors are the ones that receive most of the finance, but though the innovation which is needed, particularly in Africa, to develop adaptation solution, these initiatives don't receive funding. Let me show again some numbers. So this is the funding for startups in Africa. And you see how the total amount of money is really limited, but also it is decreasing over time. The last 3 years, it was half what it was in 2022. So there is a problem of attracting finance for innovation, for startups in Africa. Kenya is an exception. So congratulations, it's one of the countries where more resources are spent on innovative solutions, even though the total amount of money remains quite limited. And it is not true that this is the case for other kind of climate tech investments, because as you can see here, innovation in mitigation is supported by increasing resources, whereas the problem is really with adaptation. So we really should focus more on adaptation. And if you look at the distribution of resources, most of these resources go to fintech solutions. So the technology applied to financial solutions rather than on energy and other sectors where climate change may have important impact. So climate tech receives a small fraction of resources, and within climate tech adaptation receive a small part of resources. There are exceptions, for example, this fund, Catalyst Fund, is one of the few ones which is able to attract resources, in particular in Kenya, but also in other African countries, for adaptation. It is focused on innovation and adaptation, and it's quite successful in raising resources that are implemented in African countries. Finally, loans versus grants. Again, look at this picture, how loans are the preferred financing solution, which is probably not appropriate because we need more investment in equity if we want to support economic development and the development of entrepreneurship and the development of new companies in African countries. Indeed, the situation is even worse if we look at climate tech. If you look at climate tech, debt funding, loans rather than grants rather than equity is the solution which is normally applied. And again, we need more investment in equity if we want to really support the acceleration of development and of innovation in African countries. So ideas, because I discuss problems, but it is important to discuss solutions and ideas for climate finance and adaptation finance in Africa. And ideas may not be innovative enough, but certainly these are the steps we need to go through. Blended finance, cooperation with the public and private investor is very important because it's one of the ways in which you can de-risk the investment in Africa, in African countries, and in particular in innovative adaptation solutions. So guarantees, concessional loans are important ways in which blended finance can be applied. And the risking is certainly an horizontal issue, and we need to identify other ideas, other solutions to the risk investments in African countries. Green bonds are developing quite a lot, and it's important to insist to support the development of green bonds in Africa. Again, the share of green bonds over the total amount of these kind of bonds, the share in Africa is really small, and there is room for development. Debt for swap is also attracting attention. And finally, carbon markets can have a new life that can be used for reducing emission, but also to provide revenues, which is then used for adaptation. We need to recycle the increasing revenue from carbon markets into adaptation, into solution for adaptation. Look at the state of green bonds in Africa. As I said, the share of bonds is really small. Room for growth, room for new emissions of this kind of bonds, and they are increasing. And it's even though it is limited, the increase in 2023 was astonishing. And I think that this is a room that can get further development. Finally, some other ideas. Let me show my last slide. The time is limited, but I'm really glad to share with you these ideas. We need to provide conditions for investors to succeed. And I think that the focus on long-term assets, on infrastructures, on technologies that reduces vulnerability is an important focus that prepare the conditions for investors to identify solutions and also implement these solutions in African countries. The insurance industry can play an important role. The risking can go through the insurance industry. Parametric insurance can also be used to reduce risk for investors. But again, let me stress the importance to unlock finance for adaptation. It is really crucial more than any other thing, given also the limited amount of emissions in African countries. They contribute very little to climate change, but they suffer the damages. And these damages can in part be eliminated. Countries can be protected, citizens can be protected through innovative solution adaptations. And I think that what this conference can do is really to support more resources, the idea of devoting more resources to adaptation finance. Thank you very much.
The professor's slides presented a significant amount of information in a relatively short period of time. As we shift the conversation slightly to focus on trade and the relevance of trade to this conversation, by inviting Wamkele Mene to speak to us, I just wanted us to hold in mind a number of points that were made. The money isn't coming fast enough. The money is perhaps moving in the wrong direction. And the money needs to sort of come as part of a whole of system rethinking of where Africa needs to be in the next 25 to 50 years. In case it's not clear why that number matters, anyone born today, 20th of March 2025, in this continent is going to live 90% of their lives in a 3-degree or higher world. So every single person in this room that has a child, a loved one, any anticipated sort of family members are going to be living in the world that you create. If you're between the ages of 31 and 40, which many people are in the context of economic productivity right now, you're going to spend a substantial amount of your life living in an environment that is framed by the economic losses and damages that are arising because of climate change. So this conversation could not be more pivotal, and Professor Kararo, your insights help frame a very interesting discussion for later on in this session. I'm now going to ask Wamkele Mene to join us, the Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area. He's joining us from Accra. I hope he is online.
Yes, thank you. Good morning.
Good morning. We are grateful to have you with us. We don't yet quite see you on the screen, but we hear your voice, which is what really matters for this conversation. So yes, good morning, sir. Welcome. We recognize we only have about 20 minutes of your precious time. What I propose to do with those 20 minutes is ask you a couple of questions and then open up the floor to the people in the room who I'm certain will have questions and maybe even comments on the discussion we'll be having. So that's going to go for the next 15 or so minutes. And I think I would like to begin by just asking you to frame for us the challenges and the opportunities for Africa in the context of trade and the realities of just how significantly impacted Africa is from a climate perspective. As you frame those sort of thoughts for us, I just thought it would be helpful to make a couple of points. One being that the AFCFTA came into force around 2021, which is about 4 years ago, and since that time has been making significant sort of strides as an arrangement in helping African countries at a domestic, regional, and international level rethink their priorities around trade. Now, when AFCFTA was conceived of, it was a nice to have, it was an important objective, but in this day and age, it is now a critical objective because of the significant interactions we are seeing between geopolitics, trade, climate, and defense spending. So, Mr. Mene, if you could, where do you see the pressure points coming at Africa from a trade perspective when you think about climate, one, and where do you see the opportunities for Africans to really begin to focus on trade as a catalyst for building resilience?
Well, thank you very much, and good morning to you and everybody in the audience. I should have been in the room. Unfortunately, due to a personal circumstance, I was not able to travel to Nairobi. I think you've framed it, the immense challenge that climate change presents to us. You framed it quite well. There are industrial development implications. There are intra-Africa trade implications for the continent of Africa to consider as we seek to accelerate industrial development. In the great city of Nairobi, where you are, the year before our heads of states convened under the leadership of His Excellency President Ruto, the very first of its kind Africa Climate Change Summit. And it was a very important forum because for the first time, it enabled the African continent to overcome the binary debate about climate change imperatives vis-a-vis, on the one hand, on the other hand, versus the need for us to accelerate industrial development. And one of the very important outcomes of that climate summit is the Africa Green Industrialization Initiative, which President Ruto leads. And I think it is a very unique opportunity for the continent of Africa to identify the opportunities that arise in green industrialization, as well as green trade for investment. We all know very well that the pledges and commitments that were made over the years have not been fulfilled. And we all know the reasons why they have not been fulfilled. But I believe we have to focus on the current opportunities. We know that the continent of Africa contributes less than 4% to global emissions, and yet bears the brunt of the impact of climate change. We see this in excessive droughts. We see this in regions of the continent that experience floods that they have not experienced before. And so all of these various impacts really should compel us as Africans to redouble our efforts to look at alternative models of climate change finance. Yes, there are models that exist, but I think that what we need to look at are models of financing climate change, whether it is through development finance institutions or private capital. That's where I believe we will make significant progress to tackle this challenge. And let me just, on this segment, end by saying that what was very, very clear and what's very, very important as an outcome of the Nairobi climate change declaration is that the continent of Africa should not compromise on industrialization, but at the same time should not compromise on reducing the effects of climate change, that we are able to advance on both those parallel tracks. And so the existence of the AFCFTA is a very unique opportunity because it provides us with that platform to advance on green trade, green industrialization, attracting green capital to renewable energy, to solar, hydro, within a framework of harmonized rules for trade and investment.
Thank you so much. You mentioned the importance of both financing from development finance institutions and from private capital sources. The private capital sort of participation in climate finance regionally between different regions of the continent and as a whole is really low. I think it's at 4% of all climate finance in Africa, as at, I think, 2021, 2022, was coming from the private sector, as opposed to about 29% in Southeast Asia and significantly higher sums in the global north. What do you see as important sort of drivers of private capital into trade facilitative kind of development for the continent in the context of the AFCFTA's existing implementation? As at now, we have about 39 countries that have national implementation strategies and 3 regional economic communities that have plans that are integrating regional sort of approaches to trade. So in what ways can private capital be more active as a participant in supporting actors in that space, particularly small and medium enterprises?
When we started negotiating this agreement, climate change was not at the fore of the trade negotiators and the trade ministers. But obviously that had to change very, very quickly. And in the process of appreciating the global realities that climate change presented, we had to ensure that some of the provisions of the AFCFTA, the trade agreement, that these provisions address directly the challenge of climate change. So, for example, we have provisions that relate to trade in environmental goods, trade in environmental services, enabling investment in green infrastructure that supports trade. So we've had to take a very, very particular focus on how a trade agreement can be responsive to the challenges that climate change presents, which, of course, when we started negotiating, this was a classical trade agreement, but now we've had to make that shift. Now, as regards the opportunities, and particularly in terms of private capital and private financing, you mentioned the statistics. The continent of Africa receives less than 1% of global investment on climate change. This is private capital, not pledges by international development finance institutions and development partners, but by the private sector. So the threshold, threshold for investing in climate change in Africa is very, very low. This is a challenge, but it's also an opportunity for us to identify where do we want to attract and mobilize investment, private sector investment in renewable energy, as I said before, in solar, in hydrogen, in the processing of critical minerals that will enable the continued industrialization of our continent and contributing obviously to global trade and global industrial development. I think these are the opportunities that certainly present themselves, and within the framework of the Africa Green Industrialization Initiative, which is being led very, very ably by His Excellency President Ruto, we have begun that process of identifying bankable green projects, bankable green trade, green industrialization initiatives, so that our partners, global investors, are able to invest, to see the opportunities for investment, and obtain commercially priced returns on their investment in Africa's green industrialization and Africa's green trade. So yes, it is a challenge, this issue of the asymmetrical flows of private capital for climate finance, but it's also an opportunity for us to continue to mobilize into these very, very important sectors of not only Africa's industrial development, but also global industrial development. For example, I mentioned critical minerals, the processing of lithium, which is absolutely essential for transitioning to electric vehicles from combustion engines. This is an opportunity not just for Africa, but for the whole world. And so we are most grateful to the leadership of Kenya and President Ruto for setting forth a viable path and a framework to attract investment in Africa's green industrialization and green trade.
Points you've mentioned with regard to investment platforms and matching is one that will be picked up in the session after the keynote and the break that we're going to have. We have a few more minutes with you, and I wanted to open up the Q&A to the participants in the room. If there are any questions that are coming from the floor while we have you, that would be tremendous. So if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. There are roving mics, and your question will be asked. And I think as we wait on questions from the floor, a question for you, again in the context of the geopolitical environment. I think at the beginning of this year, many people did not know what a tariff was or how it worked. And by now, I'm certain in parts of Kenya, there are going to be children whose names will be Tariff. in Kenya, just as a cultural footnote, people tend to be named after significant events and seasons and things that happen. And so I am absolutely certain that one of the names in the top 10 names this year is going to be Tariff, whether as a first or a middle name. So the question I have for you is, what happens to the AFCFTA's framework and negotiations on various tariff structures in the context of the broader tariff battles we are seeing between North American countries, Europe, and China?
What we are seeing is not just unprecedented. It is deeply and profoundly a matter of concern to all of us. The weaponization of trade policy, the weaponization of tariffs targeted to those with whom we disagree is a relic of the past. What the global community should be doing is defending the multilateral trading system, the rules of the multilateral trading system, which, by the way, is not perfect, but it is a multilateral trading system that is as good as we will get as the global trading community. And therefore, we are deeply concerned by the events that are taking place since the 20th of January. As I say, this is a character of an old, outdated approach to questions of unfairness within the multilateral trading system, where one may perceive that there are questions of unfairness. They are not resolved by tariffs. They lead to, as you correctly articulated, they lead to a trade war, and there are no winners in a trade war. Everybody loses, and more importantly, the global trading community loses in the sense that we see an ever weakened multilateral trading system. The continent of Africa is obviously not completely detached from this reality. Many countries in Africa are members of AGOA, beneficiaries rather of AGOA. The likelihood is that that too will be adversely impacted by the measures that we see in the last 3 to 4 weeks, which means that we as Africans will have to redouble our efforts to accelerate the trade liberalization and the establishment of a viable domestic market of 1.4 billion people with a combined GDP of 3.4 trillion United States dollars. What is clear is that in an environment of me first and everybody else last, the continent of Africa in that environment will have to reflect very, very carefully on the tools, the trade tools that are available at our disposal to create a domestic market without, of course, disengaging from the global economy, from global supply chains. But how do we create supply chains in Africa that enable the trade resilience that we want to see, that enable the self-sufficiency in terms of development of regional supply chains? We have seen this happening in the area of the auto sector. We've seen this happening in pharmaceuticals. But the key challenge, as I see it, is for Africa to navigate these very, very turbulent times, by creating economic self-sufficiency, leveraging on this market of 1.4 billion people with a combined GDP of consumer spending and business spending of $3.4 trillion. It's a significant market, and it's a significant opportunity for us to advance on Africa's, significantly advance on Africa's economic self-sufficiency, as I say, without disengaging from the global economy.
Thank you. I'm aware our time with you is almost up, and so I shall give a last call.
We are afraid.
I think there's an atmosphere of fear and trembling in this room as we consider the note we're ending on and pivoting from, which is frankly that about how do you deal with risk when the risks are within and without? How do you deal with risk? How do you position yourself in a world where people are saying it's, me first, how do you then turn the spotlight on yourself and see what you need to do? We're hopeful that after the break that's coming up shortly, the session following the keynote speech from the Cabinet Secretary will really, really drill down into that, because opportunity is the flip side of risk. And if nothing else, our awareness right now of the risks to the international economic order and to the global social order is clear. The question is, what are the opportunities, and how do the people in this room catalyze the realization of those opportunities for the continent and for the world? Thank you so much, Wamkele, and we look forward to interacting with you further in future opportunities. If you'd like to say anything as a closing sort of point of reference, please feel free to do so.
Well, thank you very much. And again, I apologize for not being able to be there in person due to a family matter. What I would say is this, by way of closing observations. The next 4 years will be particularly turbulent. And within that turbulence and that crisis, I see an opportunity for the continent of Africa. You mentioned the need for us to quickly adapt to their reality, whether in terms of climate change, lack of finance, or indeed in the current context, the current geopolitical context. There is, in my view, an opportunity there. The combination of Africa's trade policy, Africa's industrial policy, and deployment of capital by our development finance institutions to enable these opportunities that I mentioned in various sectors of Africa's economy, particularly green industrialization and green trade. For us to realize these opportunities, it's important that we combine these three factors as we accelerate the implementation of the AFCFTA. So industrial policy, trade policy, development finance, capital and investment, deploying capital is absolutely critical for us to navigate these challenging times. So I want to thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mene. I think we can give you a round of applause on this side of the table. Thank you. So we're now at the point in the conversation where you can take a break. You can grab a coffee, you can take a rest break, you can consider the meaning of all the things that you have heard and how they make sense. And then we'll be back in 15 minutes, which is 11:10, and then pick up on the second part of this discussion. So for now, thank you so much for your time, and see you on the other side of the break. Thank you. As we begin, just by a show of hands, how many people had tea outside? Okay. How many people had coffee? Okay. How many people had water? Okay. Great. So, as we bring this conversation into a more intimate space, into a more conversational space, the reason why that informal poll actually matters is because coming back to our 25-year window and then the 25 years after that, by 2050, it is likely because of climate change that products like tea and coffee will no longer be producible or sourceable from African countries because of the change in our sort of geophysical context, the change in our rain patterns, the change in our soil productivity, and frankly, water will be a very, very expensive, very premium drink because of the levels of water scarcity that are expected to happen within the continent and within the... So, the first part of the conversation was filled with statistics and numbers and big... Sorry, I think I'll switch. Hello? I shall adapt because we're talking about adaptation. The first part of the conversation was filled with very sort of statistical, reportable, soundbite type of insights. But what we're going to try and do in this conversation with these two gentlemen, who I shall introduce shortly, is really reframe this to turn it into an actionable conversation. So for all the people in this room, we would want you to leave with an insight into why this matters, how it needs to change, and what your possible role could be, and not just as individuals and consumers, but really as catalysts for change within your organizations and within your other contexts. So on my left is Professor Richard Callan. He has worn many hats in his career, but is currently the director of the Africa Center of the University of Cambridge's Institute of Sustainable Leadership. Richard, it's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much.
And on my right is Ewan Lowe, who is the sector lead for, let me see if I get this, energy, transport, and water, and infrastructure, sorry, at the Green Climate Fund, based in South Korea, and a person who's had a storied career in all things infrastructure and energy. It's a pleasure to have you here. So as we begin, I think Ewan had the benefit of being here yesterday, and he'll speak to tying together some of the conversations from yesterday. But I wanted to start with you, Richard, to ask you from the perspective of a person who teaches, thinks deeply, is engaged in a number of conversations around sustainability, what you see as sort of the key things we need to be focusing on in this conversation, because we're trying to unlock climate finance, but there's probably a good argument to be made for the fact that the lock is broken and the keys don't work.
Yes, thank you, Angu. And first of all, let me thank you not for being the chair, although I do appreciate that, but for your attempt earlier and again now to remind us of the actual real impact of what we're talking about, the real impact of climate change and global warming. Because I think that we tend to drift past it and elide it and not really digest the consequences. Half a degree more, it seems like only half a degree, but the exponential threat and harm that will cause to lives and livelihoods, it really can't be overestimated. So in that context, therefore, this is a situation, a moment of great urgency, at a time of, as others pointed out earlier this morning, at a time of great geopolitical turbulence, and inconveniently so, because that geopolitical turbulence undermines those multilateral processes that are so essential to international cooperation. So that's our context. I want to try and make very quickly 5 headline points, and if I'm talking too long, I rely upon you to stop me. So the first is, and this is the main point I want to put as a provocation to this audience, is that we are not winning all the science tells us we are not winning. That doesn't mean there isn't progress. There is progress being made, undoubtedly. MDBs are thinking harder about this. Some capital is flowing. The ESG world has changed everything over the last 10, 15 years in terms of reporting, conduct, targets, and so on. All of that, it's all good stuff. But it's not enough. And our institutional view, expressed by my CEO, Lindsay Hooper in Cambridge, in an FT piece towards the end of last year, is that not only are we not winning, because the science tells us that, but all of that work that's been done, unfortunately, is counterproductive because it creates the veneer of success and progress. We're reporting, we're complying, we're meeting targets here and so on. 2050 targets, by the way. But we're not changing enough here and now to really shift the transition curve, which is getting ever steeper, meaning that the costs of not transitioning are getting higher and higher by the minute. So what does that mean in terms of capital and finance? It means to me that the system is broken. The finance system, the ecosystem, I'm sorry if this is offensive to those of you who work in finance, and if so, I sort of half apologize, because I want to provoke you. The system is broken. And the slide that the professor put up earlier, where he listed the things that need to be done, blended finance, green-blue bonds, de-risking, et cetera, that's been the conversation for 15 years. When I first got into climate finance after Copenhagen in 2009, that was the conversation that emerged. It's been the same conversation for 15 years. It's stale, it's not working. So I appreciate that there are new instruments, there are new ideas, but frankly, it amounts to tinkering with the deck chairs on the Titanic. It's simply not structural change. It's not shifting capital. The numbers you know about, there is money there. It's not about quantity, it's about where it goes. There's $45 trillion of private finance sitting around the world. Half of it almost sits in the hands of 58 million millionaires. Why are they not investing where they're going? Why does the system continue to reward safe, lazy investments in the global north? Why are institutional investors? So the next points will be very quick. You'll be pleased to know. Part of that conversation then has to be about de-risking, yes, because we have to incentivize capital to come to African markets and economies. So we have to think very hard about how we sell that and how we shift the risk conversation. We have to de-risk. The markets are not going to do it. We have to come up with persuasive arguments, projects, and people who can persuade those institutional and other investors that this is actually a good place to invest. Part of that is about rethinking balance sheets. Clearly, we have to, domestically, put nature assets and other forms of assets onto the balance sheet so that those balance sheets look different. And that also has to, of course, deal with debt. Because if we don't deal with the debt problem, we will not create the fiscal space to bring in domestic resources, which is also essential. Country platforms, it seems to me, are an important opportunity. I'm a governance person more than a finance person. Country platforms which focus partnerships on not just delivery, but preparation of investments and bankable, viable projects, I think are a really important opportunity that we should focus on how to do them well. They require, fourthly, good people on both sides, skills on both sides, transactional capability on both sides. And that requires an investment in human capital as well as financial capital. So my institute, therefore, works with leadership, and our strategy for the next 5 years is to build the capability across African economies to secure those transactional deals that are needed to shift capital to where it's needed on this continent. For example, the Climate Finance Leadership Program that we run with FSD Africa. Lastly, and I'm speaking to a poet, and I'm a playwright now, we have to be creative about the narrative. We have to think differently about how to tell the story, and now is a great opportunity. And as an optimist, I like to think of the Trump moment as an opportunity, as was said earlier, as an opportunity to take seriously our own responsibilities here, to escape what Professor Carlos Lopez calls the self-delusion trap of aid, to think with our partners from the global north in terms of strategic common interests rather than aid and dependency. That's the opportunity space, but we need to act very, very fast. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Richard. I think that feeling of deja vu, right? That these conversations have been had for the last 15 years, the same conversations, the same sort of potential catalysts for finance, and they haven't quite translated. And I think I would suggest to you and to everyone in this room that it's not that those are the wrong sort of levers to be pulling. It's just that there's a lack of clarity as to who pulls them, when, for how long, and to what effect. As a result of which, very often you're preaching to the choir. You know, the capital markets people will come together and talk about bonds and then leave the room. And then the DFIs will come in and talk about, you know, guarantees and then leave the room. And quite often, the actual sort of implementation partners on the ground neither know nor understand how all these things affect them, as a result of which they continue to kind of drift. So I think your analogy of the Titanic was quite apt. You know, we're all globally in the Titanic. We might be on different decks, different classes, but we're in the same boat. The iceberg is the same iceberg, and it is, in fact, right ahead. For us, though, unfortunately, because we are at the leading edge of it, both because of the continent's size and because of its unique sort of factors, we are the ones that have to save ourselves, right? Now, Ewan, just turning to you, because you were part of the conversations that happened yesterday, and you are also in a space that thinks quite deeply and quite hard about financing and models to activate the release of those funds. What is your take on some of the points Richard has raised? And what's your sort of view on the opportunity that exists if only we had the courage to step into it?
Thank you very much, Mungui. Great questions, and I'm going to come down to the floor and first of all do a bit of a recap of what we picked up yesterday, and then come back very specifically to those questions, because I think this is really interesting. So we're going to start over here, and we're going to go on a journey of value capture. It's value creation and value capture. We heard yesterday and today that we all collectively recognize that climate change is real, right down to not being able to drink our coffee and tea. But most importantly, for Africa, the most climate vulnerable people in the world are sitting here in Africa. And this really is impacting quality of life, even the ability to live. So we really need to start thinking about this in a way that talks to decision makers. And the most powerful way to do that is to understand the money. So yesterday we heard from DHL that the impact of climate change every year in Africa on infrastructure is around $7 billion. I actually think it's a lot more than that. And if I take the example of the Thai floods that happened around 10 years ago, the cost of that to Thailand was $47 billion. The floods in Pakistan was $30 billion. We also had floods in India and Sri Lanka. Similar magnitude of costs. Even America, although climate change doesn't happen in America, the New Orleans floods cost around $50 billion of GDP growth. Zeroes it out. What does that mean for countries who have very limited fiscal headroom? It's a contingent liability that hits the bottom line. It stops these countries from being able to invest in the infrastructure, the food, the water, the health security. This is real major cost. But also then, if you're industry, this hits your bottom line. The businesses in Thailand, they lost massive amounts of assets. And here's the crux. Insurance will stop paying out. Your insurance for your business is only valid as long as you have reported to the insurer of any change in the material risks you're exposed to. So your business, your assets, if hit by a climate event and you've not reported them to the insurer, your assets are at risk of being wiped out. Now that's a game changer. You should recognise that in the private sector, and government needs to communicate that to the private sector and say, we need to work on this together. So I really think there's a huge challenge for us on how do we change this. And the core to this, I think, is a value creation journey. We start off by looking at the people on the ground that really, really suffer from this. We're talking about the local communities who are the farming communities or the urban poor, and especially in the fragile conflict-afflicted states. We recognise, and we've been talking through yesterday, how locally led adaptation, gender inclusivity, civil society is very powerful in understanding what the real needs are. The Somalia FAO and GCF project that the Minister talked through yesterday, I think is an excellent example of that. That helps us to understand what these local communities' concerns are on health security, food security, water security, and where they are willing to spend their money to get these services. So as we're looking at business, here is the business opportunity. Understand what those consumers are really wanting to consume. We talk about smart cities, smart solutions. Consumers are smart. That's real smart. And they'll make smart decisions based on what they need. We need to really drive our demand assessments, our market assessments, to understand what that real value creation opportunity is. What do they really need? We do that, we can start to build a value journey, a value bridge. The next challenge is, so a call to action here is, as you're doing your business preparation, looking at how you pivot your business, really use the locally led adaptation methodologies to see what the real needs are. The next part then is understanding what the barriers are. So coming now to capacity building. GCF has spent around $212 million in Africa over 236 capacity building grants. These have helped build the national action plans, the nationally determined contributions. But that's not the end of a journey. We have $4 million per country to spend in the next period on capacity building. And what we want to really see is moving the NDC-free documentation, the national action plans, to be much more commercial about how we build up what are the issues, the barriers to being able to implement these projects. And so a call to action here is, please reach out to your country NDA and tell them what are the barriers that you're facing to be able to deliver your projects at a programmatic scale, to scale up. How can we address whether it's institutional barriers, regulatory barriers, how do we bring the financing sector to understand the liabilities and risks from climate change and make that core to the decision making. The CEOs sitting on the panel yesterday, I think, were incredibly articulate in bringing how important it is in their decision making. But they need the data, they need to understand the challenges, and they need solutions. And we're sitting with resources to help unblock these. So a call to action is, please talk to the NDAs and say, hey, we've got challenges, help us to use these resources to unlock that. Now, moving forward in the projects and programs. Again, GCF has spent or committed around 40% of its $16 billion that we have contracted to date for Africa. Huge amount of money, but at the same time, it's a drop in the ocean. We heard great ambition yesterday from the Sustainable Energy for All. We also heard many SMEs building up opportunities. The Rome electric motorcycle shows the opportunity for bringing production into countries that give local employment, that change the landscape. But they're struggling to raise capital, and they're struggling to scale up. There is human capacity challenges there. And trying to then aggregate these kind of companies to create a big enough scale that is attractive to the big venture capital funds is a challenge. We need to aggregate all this together. But aggregating that demand is really powerful because it then shows when we start to talk to country platforms, as Richard was referring to and some of our earlier speakers, how are we going to use the money to drive the climate change, the climate action? If we can aggregate up all of these needs into country platforms that show that as value chains, we are creating systemic solutions, everybody in that value chain benefits. The E&I presentation showing how the biofuels was benefiting the local farmers, the production, and then having multiple offtakes, but were then also had a beneficial use. There is so much value in that value chain, but it requires systems thinking and coming together with the different technologies and solutions. No one group can achieve this by themselves. So we need to use opportunities like this to come together and grab a few friends, make a few friends, and work in focused groups. Don't let this be a talking shop. Leave here today thinking, I want to grab 3 or 4 people that I've met and see how we create a value chain that unlocks these barriers, that allows us to have something that's transformational. That then means that when we go to the financiers, we're coming with a list of the use of funds that is going to create value. And we're asking the financiers then to build a capital stack based on what their risk appetite is. And then using organizations like GCF that can provide catalytic and concessional finance to de-risk that capital stack. That can really mobilize and unlock these monies and allow the money to flow. But it's not enough money for the transition we need, because we need hundreds of billions of dollars for Africa. So the next part of the challenge is how do we bring that together with the institutional investment? And especially I want to come back to what Mr. Nene talked about yesterday, about the importance of building up savings and also finding opportunities to capture tax. You can only capture savings and tax if you've created value, where there's a surplus that can be harvested. So we have to go through this value creation journey to achieve what Mr. Nene is saying is so important. But if we can do this smartly and build up pension funds, health insurance funds, etc., in the markets, as domestic markets, as the economy grows, as these young generation grow into blue-collar, white-collar worker employment with salaries, then you're creating these new funds. This is what is going to be transformational. And those institutional investor organizations can then be buying up these businesses that we are building and aggregating. They've got long-term patient capital, but they've got a low risk appetite. But if we can build these businesses, aggregate, divest, then the money that comes back in can be recycled to do the next lot of projects that we need. And we keep recycling the money, and that's how we're going to build up, whether it's the energy supply or the productive use of that energy into water irrigation, food production, food security, health security. And that'll bring us on a journey all the way through. So to call to action, just to finalize here, please, again, coming back to what Richard said about the narrative, the storytelling, think about where you stand in this journey and come to the next meeting thinking about how you're going to say how you've developed your part of the journey, who you're working with, and what help you need to get to the next part of the journey. And think of the next few key meetings that we have. As in this community, we heard yesterday we're going to have the Africa Climate Summit in September. We will then have the G20, then there'll be the COP30. How do we show that we're making progress to give decision makers comfort that there's progress in the journey, that they can then have confidence to invest and kickstart this whole journey? So please leave today thinking how you're going to drive your contribution into that narrative. So I hope that answered your question a little bit. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much, Ewan. I think what I really appreciate in what you've pointed out, other than the fact that you moved steadily across the room and give a real visual representation of what it means to progress this argument in this conversation was the idea of really sort of demystifying and deconstructing what are the steps that are required and who are the actors around the sort of room and around the proverbial table that need to step up. I recognize that we have a couple of minutes, and I really want to transition into questions or into reflections and comments as well from the floor. But I think to each of you, perhaps one question to sort of, or one idea to sort of capture what it is that you came in expecting from these 2 days that we've had together, and what it is that you are leaving with in terms of an understanding of what happens next. Now, we could save that for the aftermath of the Q&A because things might come out from the Q&A. But the reason I think it's important to sort of frame that is just to make the point, right, that this is not or should not be the second edition of the Climate Change Global Business Summit on Africa really shouldn't be a business as usual conversation. And whatever your expectations were coming into this room for this conversation, you need to sort of interrogate them against what you've heard, and then also reflect on what it is you intend to do next. The point you raised about there being a story to be told in this coming year is critical for 2 reasons, as I then hand it back to you. One is because COP30 is going to represent a pivotal moment of reflection around the Paris Agreement and what it has achieved and what needs to happen next. And it's a moment of reflection in the context of an acknowledgement that the world has now changed, that the lines are being redrawn quite significantly. There's an expectation that the US leaving the Paris Agreement structure could actually catalyze other countries to leave and focus on regional strategic imperatives instead of multilateral cross-cutting imperatives. So Africans don't get the chance to sit this out and see how it happens and then decide which side to pick. We need to pick our own side, right? So this point that you've made, Ewan, about the narrative and what happens between March and November is critical. The second reason why it matters is because the biodiversity conversation and biodiversity hotspots are a critical part of the African story, and they've been consistently framed as relevant in the context of just pure conservation, right? And pure kind of warm, fuzzy feelings around nature. But yet, Mount Kenya and Mount Kilimanjaro, 2 iconic mountains in this region, are on track to become the first deglaciated mountains in the world, right? So you hear about the glaciers and you hear about tipping points around ice, and you think that that's a global north problem. It's not, we have other issues to deal with, but that's happening. UNESCO has started taking steps and suggesting mitigation or adaptation measures that can be adopted, and there's some funding that's moving towards that. But the point is, the impact of that changes within the next 3 to 5 years from a water scarcity perspective in Tanzania and Kenya. It's going to have significant impact on underground water sources, right? From an ecosystem perspective, because a substantial number of the rivers, particularly in Kenya, the Tana and the Athi rivers, are fed by streams that kind of flourish in the context of the ecosystem of Mount Kenya. Businesses and the ability to sort of adapt and grow are going to be significantly affected. So those are just 2 examples of a situation where the inflection point on Paris and regional decision-making is going to be a big one for people to think about. And then locally, the inflection points around biodiversity are also really important and feed into your natural assets story. So what did you come in thinking about? What are you leaving thinking about? And then we'll take, as you gather your thoughts, my dear audience, we'll take like 3 questions and then start to wrap up.
Well, terribly quickly, because I don't wish to get in the way of the conversation with the audience, Wenge, but I came in having spent 4 days by the side of Lake Naivasha with a bunch of senior business leaders from around the continent. I came in thinking about the optimism that is still possible, despite the darkness of the data and the science. And recognizing that if you get the right people together, thinking deeply and hard enough about the problem and committing to action, you can change things fast. So that was my thought coming into this. My thought leaving it is very much focused on the G20. I live in South Africa. I'm a South African now. And the G20 is happening at a moment of extraordinary geopolitical turbulence. In normal, relatively normal times, the G20 would be the buckle that brings together the G7 with the BRICS, enlarged BRICS group, and with the opportunity to create new consensus around issues of climate action and climate finance. But of course, we know why that normal time is not there. So we have to think differently and afresh. The pressure on my country's government and my president, Cyril Ramaphosa, is to preserve that multilateral space and that process. And Ewan, I admired greatly your presentation and what you said and the way you said it. You then said what comes next is the G20 at the end of the year. I'm not really particularly interested in what happens at the government's, the leadership summit in November. I'm interested in what's happening now in the working groups. We're working, for example, with the Sustainable Finance Working Group. We're doing a leadership program with them in June. The B20 is another area. There are all these myriad, as you know, processes and groups that are going on. There's an opportunity there, regardless of what else is happening in the world, to build new points of consensus, cooperation, and collaboration. And we must seize that moment. And lastly, just on new alliances, last week there was the 8th European Union South Africa Summit. And I noted in the way it was framed, the way it was run, and the outcomes of that summit, a new approach. And I'm not talking just about the new commitments in transition finance from the European Union, important though they may be, but also the tone, texture of the summit. There was a real sense that this is the start of a new era, where, as I said earlier, a common strategic ground is found. Not who's giving the money to whom. How do we work together on the issues that are important for all of us around the world? So that need for fresh alliances, and I know that's part of the conversation here, is absolutely essential, I think.
Well, thank you. So coming into here, I was concerned largely around how the geopolitics is affecting what we're doing in Africa. And for GCF, out of the $13 billion that was pledged to us for the next 4-year period, $4 billion of that was coming from US. So it is quite a big impact on our budget. We are in a fortunate position that we've had many European countries that have stepped up and put money into our wallets, into our purse, so we're able to carry on with the momentum currently. But what I've come out of here really, really encouraged by is how much I've heard in the last couple of days of the appetite and the enthusiasm for everybody in the room to step up and fill the space, the geopolitical space that the Americans have left. Also the likes of the EBRD and others coming in and saying that they're really interested to provide the financing that was otherwise expected to be coming in from US. And then the second thing that I've just felt really encouraged again, every time I come here, I just get so inspired by the entrepreneurialism and the vitality in the young population to try drive new business. And there's so much opportunity here. I just would love to see that really flourish. Thank you.
Great. Gentlemen, thank you so much. As we conclude, I'm going to invite a couple of questions. I'd also like to present some apologies. I understand that, unfortunately, the Cabinet Secretary will not be able to join us due to, I think, an ongoing meeting at State House, which, much as we would like to think this is a really important conversation, clearly preempts this gathering. So we will take a couple of questions, maybe 2 questions if there are any, and then I will make an invitation for some closing remarks. So if you could just keep your hands up so that we can see them. It looks like there are 3 questions. Are there questions from this side of the room? 4. Okay. Keep them brief, and we will take them. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Chihenyo Kangara, Green Climate Fund. I just wanted to first thank both the presenters for making sure that we were engaged in the platform, but more importantly, raising issues that are currently on fore. You mentioned, Richard, about the investment platforms, the country platforms, and the opportunities that they bring forth. I know I'm missing government right now, but it would be interesting to hear from you in terms of looking forward, bringing on what you see could be some great opportunities on raising some of these country platforms, and where could those opportunities lie in some countries such as maybe Kenya and South Africa, but also bringing into the context of issues that the continent faces, such as fragility and vulnerability, where they might be possible to have some of these platforms. Where do you see some of those areas coming together? And maybe you could also put it into the context of the Africa Continental Trade Agreement and the various areas that in the morning were also raised. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Chinyere.
Thank you. Dario Cipolla from Italian Agency for Cooperation. I would like to step on the first, like to start from the first step that Noel mentioned, the most vulnerable that living in the farm, in the country, in the continent. So they are not only the most vulnerable, I think they are also the most numerous. And in this moment, they are the victim of climate change, and at the same time, they are part of the problem. In Africa, still, cutting a tree is more remunerative than planting a tree. And unless we change this pattern, I think that we will have not them on board. So I think that having all these millions of people on board on this climate change, just to have something more than progress, but trying to win, and putting them together with the private sector, where I was talking with somebody who was telling me that to offset their emission just for corporate responsibility, they have to buy 25 million tons of carbon for the next 20 years. And there is no this availability of carbon credits. So why don't we, I think, and I would like to know your opinion on this, why don't we strategize to put all these millions of smallholder farmers on board to compensate, to solve the issues of the soil that we have seen yesterday, to solve the issue of deforestation? And just to add one thing on the coffee issue, with these 0.5 degrees, we have to rise, we will lose 10 million hectares of coffee, and then they will be grown, just they have to gain altitude. And to gain altitude, they will cause deforestation. So the greenhouse gases will increase with any cup of coffee that we will drink. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we have two other questions. Just go ahead.
Thank you so much, Heike Hamgert, EBRD, and thanks you for the segue. We're really indeed very optimistic coming to Kenya, and Kenya being our hopefully newest shareholder. So really something from a country-led perspective, but combining multilateralism. My question is also looking at the journey you presented and a little bit where we would see us and how so my question is around, so we can do really innovative pilots together with you, and actually going out of here, we already have some ideas. But for me, the challenge is really, and we've only very rarely managed to do this, to then scale these innovative pilots that we're doing together to get to the scale that is needed, being back to the Titanic metaphor. And there it is really moving to then mobilize not just the global pension funds, but the global financial system. And there, my worry is a little bit that I think all the discussions that I had so far is that the GFANs and all of this commercial financial, they want to be de-risked to investment grade. So if the global community de-risks them to business as usual, they're happy to do it. But I think we need to also create a narrative that also they need to take at least a little bit more risk. Otherwise, it's not going to work. I think all the MDBs, all the multilateralisms in the world will not de-risk to business as usual for the global financial system. So I think my worry and my hope is that conversations like today, we also manage not to be in separate rooms, but nudge a little bit this community to take a little bit more risk.
Thank you for that. And I think there was a question here.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Munialo Rina Hatsika. I represent young people in leadership, young people in entrepreneurship, and also young people in political space. I'm from Amref Health and also Amref University. My question goes to one. My first question is, what is the role of young people towards climate change, business action, and finance? What is the role of young people towards climate change, business action, and finance? My second question goes to Professor. Kindly shed a light two ways in which young people can play and can plug into climate, business action, and finance. To Professor, kindly shed a light two ways in which young people can plug towards climate change, action, and finance. And my last question to Professor also, kindly, what is the role of politics in climate change? Thank you.
The professor gets the last question, which is possibly the hardest question. But yes, thank you all so much. These are incredibly engaging. I shall defer to my panel to take them succinct, insightful, as always.
Okay, thank you very much. Great questions. I'm going to maybe start off with the question around the agriculture space and locally led adaptation for the most fragile, conflict afflicted, the most vulnerable. This really is a big challenge, and we really, really need to work very hard at this. And we need to find, really, if I also kind of combine also with what the EBRD was referring to, the challenge of how do we scale up. Now, what I get so excited every time I come to conferences in Africa is I keep seeing so many examples of pilot projects, small projects, that are working really well in a little piece of a jigsaw. And what I think is the challenge is to bring these pieces of a jigsaw together, because if you can do that, you're creating a system where there is resiliency in the system, and you're building that value bridge that creates value for everybody who's in that system. And if we can find these value creation spaces, that then is something that can be really scaled up. Now, there is such an urgency. I'm tired and fed up now of looking at pilot projects. I don't want to do pilot projects. I want to find the projects that we can just scale up. And the challenge here is not really what are the different pieces, because they're there. There's so much proven examples. The challenge is pulling that together as a narrative where we can show that opportunity to the financiers and say, here is a big investment opportunity. We're going to aggregate these projects up. We're going to create platforms that make something that is institutionally investable. And so what we have got to do is identify the revenue streams in that. Carbon credits is one piece of a revenue stream. But there are so many other pieces of a revenue stream when you think about the challenges in that space. I'd love to dive into examples, but I don't think we've got time. Do we have time? No. No.
I think not. Do we have time? Well, yes, I see, perhaps. So yes, maybe give us like one example.
Let me give one great example.
Awesome.
Waste management is a huge problem in every urban city across Africa. And the governments have landfill sites outside the city that are full. And they're paying contractors to take that waste to the landfill sites, and a lot of it's just being dumped somewhere in the environment or into rivers, into the sea, creating another burden for us. 1 or 2 people in every 100 in an urban space is earning their living as a scavenger from that waste. $10 a day maximum income. And yet, there is a whole value creation opportunity in this space. If you collect up the PET bottles, a scavenger may earn around $10 a day, but the value of a ton of that waste by a trader in the middle of that space earns around $150 per ton. When that's sold on to another trader in the aggregating space, sells for around $200 a ton. When that PET is processed, it sells for around $850, $900 a ton. If you can put a value chain and extended producer responsibility, we've got an expert in the back of the room on this, you can then get a premium. If you're Coca-Cola or Unilever, you will pay a premium to get that PET. It's demonstrably certified as coming from recycled resources, $1,100 a ton typically. If we can capture that waste, when it's all the different types of waste, you're creating value and you're saving the waste to have to go to landfill. And from a climate perspective, we no longer have waste sitting in a landfill generating methane. So we have value capture opportunities all the way through that process, revenue generating opportunities in terms of capturing these resources, meaning we're not having to extract raw resources, but selling these resources as plastics, paper, metals, energy, composts. We're avoiding costs in the landfill. And also we've got, under things like extended producer responsibility, organizations who will pay money into that space. And I've seen every single piece of that jigsaw in places across Africa, but I've never seen it all come together.
Thank you. I don't think that's